The dust on the moon of Loomis did not settle like dust on Earth. It hung in the thin atmosphere, a persistent, silvery fog that tasted of ozone and ancient regret. It had been 14 months since the Treaty of the Gray Horizon was signed, ending the 70-year war between humanity and the Nerian Dominion, but the scars on the landscape remained fresh. The craters here were not natural. They were geometric, fused into glass by orbital lances, jagged reminders of a conflict that had consumed 3 generations. Adrian Cole stood at the edge of the newly designated Peace Zone Alpha, adjusting the collar of his uniform. It was a civilian uniform, now a soft slate-gray tunic, that was supposed to signify neutrality and healing. It felt alien to him. Underneath the fabric, his skin still remembered the rigidity of a dress uniform, and his mind still organized the world into sectors of engagement supply lines and attrition probabilities. He closed his eyes for a second, forcing the tactical overlay in his brain to shut down. He was not a strategic analyst anymore. He was a coordinator. He was here to help people breathe. "You are doing it again," a voice said beside him. Adrian opened his eyes to see Dr. Harper Lynn standing there, holding 2 tablets and looking unimpressed. She was a woman of sharp intelligence and even sharper patience, one of the few people on Loomis who knew Adrian was running from something, though even she did not know the specifics of the algorithm he had buried deep in the classified archives. "Doing what?" Adrian asked, smoothing his tunic. "Categorizing the crowd by threat level," Harper said. "I can see your eyes darting. That Nerian elder over there is not a sniper target, Adrian. He is holding a ceremonial incense burner." "It looks heavy," Adrian muttered. "Blunt force trauma potential." Harper sighed, tapping her stylus against her tablet. "Relax. Today is the inauguration of the war tent. It is supposed to be symbolic. We are turning a command center into a sanctuary. Try to look less like you are waiting for an orbital bombardment, and more like you are ready to facilitate group therapy." Adrian looked out over the assembly area. It was an impressive, if terrifying, sight. 2,000 attendees had gathered on the flattened plain of the crater. On the left stood the human delegation, tired veterans in dress blues, politicians sweating in the atmospheric regulators, and the families of the fallen. On the right stood the Nerians. They were a striking species, feline humanoid, in structure, standing on average a head taller than most humans. Their fur ranged from the color of deep charcoal to snow white, and their movements possessed a fluid, predatory grace that made human soldiers look clumsy by comparison. They wore their ceremonial armor plates of matte ceramic, etched with the history of their clans, but their weapons had been stripped away. In the center of this divide stood the structure of the war tent. It was a massive construct of dark woven fibers billowing slightly in the artificial gravity currents. During the war, a tent of this size would have housed the high command of a Nerian legion. It was a place where death was dealt. Now the sides were rolled up and soft amber lights glowed from within. It had been rechristened the War Tent of Memory. "It is quite a statement," Adrian admitted, reclaiming the symbol of their conquest. "It is healing," Harper corrected him. "Recontextualization. Which reminds me the guest of honor is arriving. Try not to stare." A hush fell over the crowd, a silence so profound it seemed to suck the sound out of the air scrubbers. From the Nerian side, a small entourage approached. At the front walked General Naira Karras. Even Adrian, who had spent 5 years studying Nerian psychological profiles and command structures, felt an involuntary shiver trace down his spine. The Cat General, as the human press had dubbed her, was a living legend. She was tall, her fur a sleek dark graphite color, marked by 3 distinct pale scars running from her left temple down to her jaw. She wore a set of battle armor that had clearly seen combat, though it had been polished to a dull sheen. Her helmet was held under one arm, revealing eyes that glowed with a bioluminescent amber intensity. She did not walk like a diplomat. She walked like a predator patrolling its territory, her steps silent, despite the heavy boots. "She looks intense," Adrian whispered. "She commanded the siege of Sector 4, Harper whispered back. "She held the line for 600 days against 3 orbital fleets. She is not just intense, Adrian. She is history." General Naira took her place on the raised dais in front of the war tent. She stood perfectly still, her ears twitching slightly, swiveling to capture the ambient noise of the crowd. She looked bored, or perhaps just deeply skeptical of the proceedings. The ceremony began with the usual pomp. A human politician, Colonel Jace Ward, took the podium first. He was a man with a square jaw and a haircut that looked like it had been measured with a laser level. He spoke of new horizons and bridging the gap, but his eyes remained cold, scanning the Nairian ranks with suspicion. Adrian turned him out. He had heard these speeches 1,000 times. His job was the logistics of the program that would follow the mixed species support groups, the art therapy sessions using scrap metal, the shared grief rituals. He checked his risk comp. The timeline was already slipping by 7 minutes. "This is going to be a disaster," Adrian murmured to Harper, as Colonel Ward droned on about economic cooperation. "Have faith," Harper replied, though she was frantically checking her own schedule. "I am serious." Adrian leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. The stress of the past year, the crushing weight of his hidden guilt, and the absurdity of the moment made him lightheaded. He needed to deflate the tension before he snapped. "Look at her, General Chorus. She looks like she would rather gut someone than hold a candle. If this program does not collapse after the first month, I will eat my datapad." Harper raised an eyebrow. "Is that a wager?" Adrian glanced at the imposing figure of the general on the stage. The amber eyes seemed to be scanning the horizon, ignoring the human speaker entirely. "Better yet," Adrian whispered, a reckless grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "If we survive 30 days without a diplomatic incident, I will personally woo the cat general. I will invite her to my quarters, brew her some of that calming herbal tea I imported, and play her my exclusive post-war chill playlist. I bet she just needs someone to listen to her without trying to shoot her." It was a throwaway comment. A stupid, stress-induced joke, meant for an audience of one. But Adrian had forgotten one critical detail. To facilitate communication for the event, all staff members had been issued universal translator collars. These devices were older military surplus repurposed for the peace effort. They were prone to glitches, sensitivity errors, and most critically, they had a lag time. Adrian had forgotten to mute him. The microphone on his collar picked up his whisper. It processed the syntax, filtered it through the complex linguistic algorithms of the Nerian High Tongue, and then, because the main audio system for the event was linked to the coordinator's frequency for announcements, it broadcast the translation across the entire crater. However, Nerian is a language of high context and ritual. There is no direct word for woo in the romantic casual human sense. The computer, searching for the closest equivalent regarding a warrior of high status, chose a phrase from the ancient feudal dialects. Likewise, herbal tea was interpreted as ceremonial bonding elixir, and playlist became recitation of the soul's rhythm. So, while Adrian heard his own whisper fade, the massive speakers surrounding the war tent boomed out a deep, synthetic Nerian voice that echoed like thunder. "I, Adrian Cole, solemnly pledge to pursue the heart and spirit of General Nira Karis. I shall offer her the elixir of binding, and expose the rhythms of my soul to her in the sanctuary of my dwelling, seeking to soothe the warrior's burden." The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the silence of a pause. It was the silence of a vacuum. Colonel Ward stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. The human delegation looked confused, their translators taking a moment to reverse engineer what had just been said. But the Nerian reaction was immediate and terrifying. 500 Nerian veterans simultaneously turned their heads to look at Adrian. Their movement was so synchronized it looked like a ripple in a dark pond. Their ears flattened against their skulls. A low, vibrating thrum began to rise from their chests, a collective growl that could be felt in the floorboards of the dais. Adrian froze. The blood drained from his face so fast he felt dizzy. He tapped his collar, realizing with horror that the light was still green. "Oh," he breathed. "Oh no." On the stage, General Naira Karras slowly turned her head. Her glowing eyes locked onto Adrian. She did not look angry. She looked focused, like a tiger that had just noticed a gazelle wearing a funny hat. Dr. Harper Lynn was staring at her tablet, her face pale. "Adrian," she hissed, "what did you just say?" "I was joking," Adrian squeaked. "It was a joke." A tall, elderly Nerian stepped forward from the general's side. This was Elder Sereth, the keeper of the histories. He wore robes of woven gray moss and carried a staff made of twisted bone. He raised a hand, and the low growling of the soldiers ceased instantly. Elder Sereth walked to the edge of the stage and looked down at Adrian. His face was unreadable, a mask of fur and wrinkles. "The human Adrian Cole has spoken the right of the hearth," Sereth announced, his voice amplified by his own collar. "He has publicly invoked the bond of wounds with a high general." A murmur rippled through the human side. "Bond of wounds?" someone asked. "Is that a threat?" Sereth continued his tone, lecturing as if explaining gravity to a toddler. In the old ways, when the war season ended, a warrior could not simply return to peace. The blood was too loud in their ears. So a partner would step forward, a brave soul who offers to share the weight of the memories, to drink the bitter tea of remembrance and listen to the songs of sorrow until the warrior could sleep again. It is a courtship of the spirit, a proposal to share the burden of survival. The elder paused, looking from Adrian to Naira. It is rarely offered by one species to another, and never quite so publicly. Adrian wanted the ground to open up and swallow him whole. He wanted a meteor to strike him. He wanted to be back in the strategic bunker, analyzing supply chains anywhere but here. He had just accidentally proposed spiritual marriage to the deadliest woman in the galaxy. Colonel Ward marched over to Adrian, his face turning a shade of purple that defied the color spectrum. "Cole," he growled, forgetting his microphone was off. "What the hell do you think you are doing? This is a diplomatic incident. You are mocking their customs." "I didn't mean to," Adrian stammered, his hands held up in surrender. "It was a translation error. I was just talking about tea." "The intent of the word is carried in the breath," Elder Sereth said, his hearing sharp enough to catch the exchange. "The machine translates the vibration of the soul. The offer has been witnessed." The crowd was growing restless. The Nerians looked offended that a human would dare such a thing, while others looked strangely curious. The humans just looked terrified that the shooting was about to start again. Then General Naira Karras moved. She stepped past Elder Sereth. The sound of her boots on the metal staging was heavy, deliberate. Clank, clank, clank. She stopped at the edge of the platform, towering over Adrian. From this angle, she blocked out the harsh sunlight of Loomis, casting him in her shadow. Her eyes were not glowing with rage, Adrian realized. They were glowing with calculation. She was assessing him. She was looking at his posture, his terrified eyes, his trembling hands. She leaned down just an inch, her voice low and raspy, like gravel grinding together. "You offer the bond human." Adrian opened his mouth, but no sound came out. If he said no, if he claimed it was a joke, he would be insulting her, her culture, and the entire ceremony. He would confirm everything the detractors said about humans, that they were shallow, disrespectful, and incapable of understanding the gravity of war. The peace camp would be discredited before it opened. But if he said yes, he looked at Harper. She shook her head slightly, her eyes wide. He looked at the crowd. He saw the faces of the Nerian veterans. They were waiting. They were waiting to see if the human would back down if he was a coward. Adrian Cole had spent the last 2 years of the war hiding behind screens, sending algorithms to do the killing. He had hidden his guilt behind a wall of data. He was tired of hiding. He swallowed hard. He straightened his back. It was the most terrified he had ever been in his life. Adrian's voice cracked. He cleared his throat. I said it. The words are, they are out there. Nira stared at him for a long moment. A muscle in her jaw twitched. Her whiskers shifted forward, then back. Then she stood up straight and addressed the crowd. Her voice did not need the microphone to carry power. The humans do not understand our ways, Nira declared. They speak carelessly like children playing with fire. A sigh of relief went through the human delegation. She was going to dismiss him. She was going to call him an idiot and move on. However, Nira continued, her voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerous. A vow spoken before the war tent is binding. To reject it is to say that the listener is unworthy of the effort. I am Nira Karis of the Third Claw, and I have never been unworthy. She looked back down at Adrian. A corner of her mouth lifted. It was not a smile. It was a challenge. I accept the trial of the bond of wounds, but not for life. We are not there yet. I am granted a probationary period. 32 days. 1 full cycle of the moon. She pointed a clawed finger at him. Adrian Cole. You say you wish to soothe the warrior's burden? You say you have the rhythms to quiet the ghosts. Very well. Tonight, at the hour of the second moonrise, you will come to my war tent. We will see if your spirit is as loud as your mouth. She turned on her heel, her cape swirling around her ankles, and marched back into the darkness of the tent. Ceremony dismissed, Elder Sereth announced, looking absolutely delighted by the turn of events. The crowd erupted into chaos. Journalists began shouting questions. Colonel Ward looked like he was having a stroke. Harper Lynn simply put her head in her hands and groaned. Adrian stood frozen in the center of the madness, staring at the empty space where the general had stood. 32 days, he whispered to himself. I have to survive 32 days. The sun set quickly on Loomis, plunging the crater into a darkness that was absolute, save for the floodlights of the camp. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in an hour. Adrian stood in front of the mirror in his small, modular quarters. He looked pale. He had changed out of his ceremonial uniform into his regular work clothes, a thick, knitted sweater, and cargo trousers, but he felt like he was dressing for an execution. You do not have to go, Harper said. She was sitting on his bunk, watching him pace. We can issue a formal apology. We can say you had a seizure. We can say the translator was hacked. And humiliate her, Adrian asked, splashing cold water on his face. Did you see the look in those veterans' eyes, Harper? If I back out now, I will prove them right. I prove that humans treat their sacred traditions as a punchline. The trust index in the camp would drop to 0. The hardliners like Ward would use it as an excuse to segregate the groups again. So you are doing this for the diplomatic mission? Harper asked skeptically. I am doing this because I caused it, Adrian said. He dried his face with a towel. And because she accepted. She accepted because she backed herself into a corner, Adrian. Or because she wants to skin you alive in private. Thank you, Dr. Lin. Your psychological support is overwhelming. Adrian picked up a thermos. Inside was the herbal tea he had joked about. It was a blend of chamomile and valerian root, something his grandmother used to make. It seemed pitifully inadequate for an alien warlord who had crushed the 5th Mechanized Infantry Division. What is in the bag? Harper asked, pointing to a canvas satchel by the door. My datapad, the playlist, Adrian said, his voice flat. If I am going to die, I am going to die committed to the bit. He checked the time. It was 1900 hours. The second moon was rising. Wish me luck, he said. I will have the medbay on standby, Harper replied cheerfully. Adrian stepped out into the cold night air. The camp was quiet, but he could feel eyes on him. The walkway to the war tent was long and lit by low-level amber guide lights. The gravel crunched loudly under his boots. The war tent loomed ahead a dark mountain against the star-strewn sky. It breathed the heavy fabric sides moving slightly in the wind. Smoke curled from the central vent at the top, smelling of burning sage and something metallic like copper. There were 2 Nerian guards at the entrance. They were massive, holding ceremonial halberds. As Adrian approached, they did not ask for identification. They simply stepped aside, crossing their weapons behind him. Once he passed the threshold, he was trapped. He stood in the entryway, a small vestibule before the main chamber. The air here was warmer, thick with the scent of spices and fur. He could hear movement inside the heavy pacing tread of someone who could not sit still. Adrian took a deep breath. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He remembered the algorithm he had written. He remembered the supply lines he had severed. He remembered the reports of starving Nerian units. He was walking into the den of the enemy he had helped destroy armed, only with a thermos of tea and a collection of ambient electronic music. He reached out and pushed aside the heavy leather flap, separating him from the main chamber. "General," he called out, his voice trembling only slightly. "I brought the tea." From the shadows of the vast, dimly lit tent, 2 glowing amber eyes opened and fixed upon him. "Enter Adrian Cole," the deep voice rumbled. "The fire is lit. Let us see what you are made of." The interior of the war tent was a cathedral of shadows and history. From the outside it was merely an imposing structure of dark fiber, but inside the air held a different weight, heavy, with the scent of ozone, dried sage, and the musk of old fur. The ceiling vaulted high above, supported by rib-like struts that groaned softly in the lunar wind, creating a sound not unlike a breathing beast. Adrian Cole stood near the entrance, his eyes adjusting to the dim amber lighting. In the center of the vast space dominated a massive holographic strategic table. During the war, this table would have displayed troop movements and orbital bombardment trajectories in crisp, lethal red. Now, the emitter was damaged, flickering with a ghostly, desaturated blue light that showed the terrain of Loomis, not as a battlefield, but as a scarred topography of craters and ridges. Around the perimeter of the tent, the walls were adorned with the debris of conflict. There were rows of Nerian clan badges, jagged pieces of human plasteel armor, and photographs of squads from both sides pinned to the fabric. It was a chaotic museum of grief. General Naira Karras stood by the holographic table. Without her helmet, the sharp angles of her face were more pronounced, the bioluminescent glow of her eyes illuminating the scars that ran down her cheek. She was tracing a finger through the flickering blue light of a mountain range where thousands had died. "You stand there as if you are waiting for an execution squad, Adrian Cole," Naira said, not looking up. Her voice was a low rumble that vibrated in Adrian's chest. "I am just admiring the decor," Adrian replied, stepping forward. He forced his hands to remain steady at his sides. "It is intimidating." "It is true," Naira corrected. She turned to face him. "This tent was my command post for 3 years. I ordered the death of 6,000 of your kin from this very spot, and I watched 8,000 of my own die while standing exactly where you are standing now." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Naira walked around the table, her movements fluid and silent despite the heavy boots she wore. She stopped 3 feet from him, close enough that he could see the individual whiskers twitching near her jaw. "Tell me, human, do you understand the bond of wounds? Or was your declaration truly just the babbling of a fool with a broken translator?" Adrian met her gaze. He had spent the walkover rehearsing a dozen diplomatic apologies, but looking at her now, seeing the exhaustion hidden deep within those predator eyes, he realized that diplomacy was the wrong tool. She did not want a politician. She wanted a soldier, or at least someone with the spine of one. I do not understand it, Adrian admitted quietly. Not the way you do. To me, it sounded like a poetic way to say we are all broken. But I did not mean to mock you. I made a joke to a friend because I was terrified and the universe decided to punish me. But now that I am here, I want it to mean something. I want it to mean something good. Naira studied with him. She leaned in, sniffing the air near his shoulder. Adrian held his breath. You smell of fear, she observed, but not deception. That is a rare combination in humans. From the shadows behind the General Elder, Sereth emerged. The old Nerian leaned heavily on his bone staff, his eyes twinkling with amusement. The spirits are fond of irony, General, Sereth said. Perhaps this accidental proposal is exactly what the camp needs. A bridge built on a blunder is still a bridge. What are the terms, Elder Mir? Naira asked, crossing her arms over her chest plate. 32 days, Sereth announced. A full cycle of the Great Moon. You and Adrian Cole will share the stewardship of this tent. You will lead the healing circles together. You will listen to the ghosts of both sides. If at the end of the cycle the bond has brought peace to the living, we will consecrate it. If it brings only discord, we will dissolve it, and no honor will be lost. Naira looked at Adrian, her expression unreadable. You are a coordinator of therapy, yes. Do you have charts and theories? I have methods, Adrian said. I can facilitate. Then facilitate, Naira said, gesturing to the empty expanse of the tent. We begin tomorrow. Do not make me regret not gutting you on the stage. The first session was a disaster that bordered on farce, followed closely by tragedy. They had arranged 50 chairs in a circle standard human support group protocol and 50 large cushions for the Nerians, who preferred to sit low to the ground. The attendance was mandatory for certain units, voluntary for others, resulting in a room filled with resentful human Marines and Nerian shock troopers, who looked like they would rather be undergoing root canal surgery without anesthesia. Adrian stood in the center, holding a data pad that felt slippery in his sweating palms. Naira sat on a raised dais to the side, silent, watching like a judge. Welcome, Adrian began, his voice echoing slightly, too much in the high ceiling. We are here to start a dialogue, to find common ground in our shared experiences, a human corporal snorted. Common ground. They shot my leg off. That is our common ground. A low growl rippled through the Nerian side. Let us start with something simple, Adrian said quickly, pivoting to his training. Breathing. Trauma locks the body in a state of fight or flight. If we can regulate our breath, we can signal safety to our nervous systems. He demonstrated a 4-count box breathing technique. The humans grudgingly played along, inhaling and exhaling with exaggerated boredom. The Nerians, however, stared at him in confusion. Human, a Nerian warrior named Varric interrupted. He was missing an ear and his fur was patchy from burn scars. Why are you panting? Is the air supply failing? No, Adrian explained. It is a relaxation technique. To hold the breath is to prepare for the pounce, Varric stated flatly. To exhale is to strike. You are asking us to simulate combat in a circle. This is foolish. Naira made a sound in her throat, a short, sharp chuff. It might have been a laugh or it might have been a cough. Adrian chose to believe it was a cough. Okay, Adrian said, shifting tactics. Let us try talking. Who would like to share a recurring difficulty they have faced since the ceasefire? The floodgates opened, but not in the way Adrian had hoped. The humans spoke of nightmares. They described the flashes of light, the sound of plasma tearing through air, the faces of friends dissolving in the dark. Their trauma was individual, sharp, and visceral. The Nerians, when they finally spoke of silence. I cannot hear my ancestors, a young female warrior whispered. The bombardment cracked the ancestral stones of my village. My lineage is silent. I am no one. I am a leaf disconnected from the tree." The humans looked confused. To them, survival was the victory. To the Nereians, survival without connection was a form of purgatory. The atmosphere in the tent grew heavy, a suffocating mixture of anger and existential dread. The humans felt the Nereians were being dramatic about rocks. The Nereians felt the humans were selfishly obsessed with their own biological survival. Tension began to rise. A human sergeant muttered a slur. A Nereian unsheathed a ceremonial dagger just an inch, but enough to catch the light. Adrian stepped forward, raising his hands, but he felt small against the tide of animosity. He was losing them. The pattern of the room was spiraling toward violence. Then General Nyra stood up. The sound of her armor shifting was enough to silence the room. She walked to the center of the circle, eclipsing Adrian. She did not look at the Nereians. She looked at the humans. "You dream of fire," Nyra said, her voice soft but carrying to the back of the tent. "I dream of ice." She turned slowly, addressing everyone. "I had a lieutenant. His name was Kalen. He was barely out of his first molt. During the retreat from Sector 7, the human artillery had pinned us in a ravine. I calculated the odds. I needed a distraction to save the battalion." She paused, her amber eyes dimming slightly. "I ordered Kalen to hold the ridge. He knew what it meant. He looked at me and he did not ask for mercy. He asked if his death would buy enough time. I told him yes. It was a lie. I knew it would only take 5 minutes, but I needed those 5 minutes." The tent was absolutely still. Even the air scrubbers seemed to pause. "I hear his voice every night," Nyra confessed, touching the scar on her jaw. "He does not scream. He simply asks, 'General, was 5 minutes enough?' And I have to wake up and answer him night after night that it was not." She looked down at the human corporal who had spoken earlier. "We do not share a biology soldier, but we share the ghosts. They stand at the foot of my bed just as they stand at yours." The corporal swallowed hard, looking down at his prosthetic leg. The Nereian warrior, Varric, sheathed his dagger completely. Adrian watched Nyra, his heart aching, with a sudden, sharp realization. He had thought of her as a symbol, a monolith of Nereian strength. But beneath the armor and the reputation, she was just another soldier trying to outrun the guilt of survival. "Thank you, General," Adrian said softly. Nyra nodded once, sharp and dismissive, and returned to her seat. But the energy in the room had shifted. The hostility had not vanished, but it had lost its edge. It had been replaced by a somber, shared recognition of pain. Not everyone was pleased with the progress in the war tent. 2 days later, Colonel Jace Ward stood on the observation deck of the main administration tower, looking down at the peace camp through digital binoculars. Beside him stood Captain Targle, a Nereian officer, known for his rigid adherence to the old code. "They are sitting in circles," Ward muttered, lowering the binoculars. "Holding hands, practically. It is disgusting." "It is dishonorable," Targle corrected, his tail lashing behind him in agitation. "To share the sacred grief with the enemy is to dilute the blood of the fallen. General Karras has been away from the homeworld too long. She has forgotten that peace is merely a pause between wars." "My concern is readiness," Ward said, smoothing his pristine uniform. "If the truce breaks, and it will break, Captain History guarantees it, I need soldiers, not poets. Cole is turning them into soft targets. He is encouraging them to weep. You cannot aim a rifle if your eyes are full of tears." "And the budget," Targle noted, a cynical edge to his voice. "The resources poured into this healing could be used to rebuild the fortifications." "Exactly," Ward nodded. "We need to show the Council that this experiment is failing. That is dangerous." "The bond of wounds is sacred," Targle mused. "But if the bond is shown to be weak, if it is shown to cause chaos, rather than order, then the Elder will have no choice but to sever it." The two officers exchanged a look. It was not a look of friendship, but of shared utility. They were men of the sword, and they found the plowshare deeply offensive. Despite the looming shadows of politics, life in the war tent began to develop a rhythm, and surprisingly, a sense of humor. Adrian realized early on that trauma was too heavy to carry 24 hours a day. Sometimes, you had to put it down and laugh at the absurdity of it all. On the 10th day, Adrian decided to introduce physical therapy. "We hold tension in our bodies," Adrian explained to the mixed group. "We are going to try some basic stretches. Humans call this yoga." He led them through a series of poses. The humans, stiff from low gravity and combat injuries, groaned and cracked. But the comedy truly began with the Nerians. Nerian anatomy was feline-based. Their spines were incredibly flexible, but their center of gravity was different. When Adrian demonstrated the downward dog pose, the Nerians copied it with effortless, terrifying perfection, their backs arching into steep curves, their claws extending into the mats. "This is not a stretch," a Nerian grumbled from the floor, his face pressed into the mat. "This is how we prepare to vomit a hairball." The human soldiers erupted into laughter. It was the first time genuine laughter had echoed in the war tent. "Okay," Adrian said, trying to hide his own smile. "Fair point. Perhaps you can teach us something." One of the Nerian scouts stood up. "The stalking walk. It aligns the vertebrae and focuses the mind." He demonstrated a low, prowling movement, moving on hands and feet with silent precision. "All right," Adrian said to the humans. "Give it a try." It was a catastrophe. The humans, lacking the pelvic structure and the tail for balance, looked like drunken crabs. One Marine tipped over immediately, knocking into a support pillar with a loud clang. Another tried to mimic the fluidity, and ended up headbutting the posterior of the person in front of him. The Nerians chattered a sound that was their version of giggling. "You move like wounded beetles," Varric observed, but his voice lacked its usual malice. He reached out a hand and pulled the fallen Marine to his feet. "Keep your hips lower, like this." For a moment, the war was forgotten. There were just bodies awkward, and trying bridging the gap between species through the universal language of physical comedy. That evening, the mood in the tent was quiet. The session had been grueling, a deep dive into the guilt of survivors who felt they should have died instead of their friends. Adrian stayed behind to clean up. He was stacking the chairs, his back aching, his mind replaying the stories he had heard. He felt drained, hollowed out by the empathy he was forced to deploy. "You look like Shedskin," a voice said. Adrian turned to see Naira walking toward him. She was holding 2 steaming clay cups. "General," Adrian said, straightening up. "I was just finishing." "Sit," she commanded, pointing to a pile of cushions. Adrian sat. Naira handed him one of the cups. It was hot, smelling of earth and something sweet. "It is not alcohol," she said, sitting down opposite him. "It is Valis root. It quiets the noise in the head. You cannot heal anyone if you do not sleep, Adrian Cole." Adrian took a sip. It was bitter, but the warmth spread through his chest immediately. "I thought you preferred the elixir of binding, I promised you," he joked weakly. Nira's whiskers twitched. She took a sip of her own tea, her eyes fixing on him over the rim of the cup. "If you ever attempt to woo me with a translator again," she said, her voice deadpan, "I will make you lead 3 more groups. With the junior cadets. They bite." Adrian laughed, and this time it was a real laugh. "Deal. No more translators. I will learn High Nerian if I have to." "Do not hurt yourself," Naira said, but the glow in her eyes was softer than he had ever seen it. "You are doing adequate work, Adrian. The soldiers are talking. Even Varric." "They are tired of being angry," Adrian said. "Anger is exhausting." "Anger is fuel," Naira countered gently. "But fuel burns out. You are teaching them to build a fire that warms instead of burns. That is impressive." Adrian felt a flush of pride that had nothing to do with the tea. He looked at Nera, really looked at her. He saw the way her ears swiveled toward every sound, the constant vigilance she could not turn off. He saw the loneliness of a commander who could never show weakness. "And you, General?" Adrian asked softly. "Is your fire warming you?" Nera looked away, staring at the flickering hollow table. "I am a creature of winter, Adrian. Warmth is strange to me." She hesitated, then looked back at him. "Why did you take this job? You have the mind of a strategist. I have seen the way you organize the groups, the way you analyze the emotional dynamics. You see patterns before they form. You are not just a logistical officer." Adrian froze. The warmth of the tea turned to ice in his stomach. "I was an analyst," he stammered, his hand trembling slightly. "Back in the rear echelon, supply chain optimization. Boring stuff." "Supply chains win wars," Nera said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "There was a supply chain disruption in Sector 4. The starvation siege, it was brilliant. Brutal. A mathematical masterpiece of denial. It forced us to surrender a fortified moon in 3 weeks because we ran out of filtration coils." She was watching him closely, too closely. "I heard about that," Adrian lied, staring into his tea. "Terrible business." "The algorithm that predicted our consumption rates was specific," Nera continued. "It anticipated our rationing protocols perfectly. Whoever wrote it knew us better than we knew ourselves." Adrian's heart hammered against his ribs. He had written that algorithm. He had sat in a quiet room, drinking coffee, and typed the lines of code that had slowly strangled thousands of Nerians. He had turned their discipline against them. "I should go," Adrian said abruptly, standing up. He nearly knocked over his cup. "I have paperwork, logs to file." Nera did not move. She remained seated, sipping her tea, her glowing eyes tracking his hasty retreat. She did not say anything, but the air between them had shifted. The comfort was gone, replaced by a sharp, lingering suspicion. The next morning, the fragility of their progress became undeniable. When Adrian arrived at the war tent, he found a crowd gathering at the entrance. Voices were raised. Nerian growls mixed with human shouts. "What is happening?" Adrian pushed through the crowd. Inside the war tent had been violated. The memorial wall, the sacred space where photographs and tokens of the fallen were pinned, had been defaced. A stripe of red paint the color of fresh blood had been slashed across the faces of the Nerian dead. On the human side, the votive candles that were lit every morning had been extinguished. In their place, someone had lined up spent shell casings, the heavy brass of anti-personnel rounds. "Who did this?" Varric was shouting, his claws fully extended. "Which of you hairless apes desecrated my brother's image?" "Watch your mouth, cat!" a human sergeant yelled back. "Look at the candles, you think we put bullets on our own altar." "It is a threat," Varric roared. "Stop," Adrian yelled, stepping between them. "Stop it! This is exactly what someone wants." Nera appeared from the back of the tent. She did not yell. She simply exuded a pressure that forced everyone to step back. She walked to the wall, touching the red paint. It was still wet. "This was not done by a soldier," Nera said coldly. "A soldier respects the dead, even the enemy's dead. This is the work of a coward." She turned to Adrian. "This facility is under your security coordination, Cole. How did this happen?" "I do not know," Adrian said, feeling the weight of accusation from both sides. "The cameras, I will check the logs." "Do that," Nera said. "Because 32 days is a long time, Adrian, but patience runs out much faster." Later that night, Adrian sat in the security booth, scrubbing through the footage. The files were corrupted. Someone with high-level access had looped the feed. It was a professional job. He sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He knew intuitively that this was Ward and Targel. He could see the pattern, the escalation. First the whispers, now the vandalism. Next would be violence. But he had no proof. And worse, he felt the walls of his own secret closing in. Naira's questions about the starvation siege were not idle curiosity. She was hunting. And if she found out that the man trying to heal her people was the same man who had starved them. The door to the security booth opened. Naira stood there. She looked tired. Her fur ruffled the bioluminescence of her eyes dim. "The logs?" she asked. "Corrupted," Adrian admitted. It was an inside job. Naira stepped into the small room. The space was too small for both of them. He could smell the ozone and rain on her cloak. "They want us to fail," Naira said softly. "My officers, your commanders. They are afraid of what happens if we succeed." "They are afraid of peace," Adrian said. "No," Naira corrected. "They are afraid of forgiveness. Because if forgiveness is possible, then their hatred becomes useless. And they have built their entire identities on hatred." She looked down at him, her expression searching. "Adrian, do you believe this bond of ours is strong enough? Can it hold the weight of this hate? Can it hold the weight of the secrets we keep?" Adrian looked up at her. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to confess about the algorithm, about the guilt that ate him alive, about why he was really here. But he was a coward. He was afraid that if he spoke, the light in her eyes would turn to fire and burn him to ash. "I do not know if it is strong enough," Adrian said, his voice breaking. "But I know that I am tired of hiding. I was part of the machine, Naira. I was a gear in the engine that crushed this world. Maybe it is time I stop pretending I am just a healer." Naira stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. Then she reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. Her claws were retracted, her paw heavy and warm. "We are all gears, Adrian," she whispered. "The question is not what you were. The question is whether you can jam the machine." She turned and left him alone in the flickering light of the monitors. Adrian sat there staring at the blank screen. He knew what he had to do. He had to stop Ward and Targle. But to do that, he would have to use the one thing he had sworn never to use. Again, his strategic mind. He would have to think like a weapon to save the peace. And he knew, with a sinking dread, that the price of saving the war tent would likely be losing Nira forever. The 32nd day arrived not with a bang, but with a static hum that vibrated through the floorboards of the entire camp. It was the hum of high-voltage transmission equipment being tested, of atmospheric shuttles landing, and of 1,000 nervous systems stretched to their breaking point. The trial of the bond was ending. The grand ceremony, dubbed the Convergence of Memory, was scheduled for 1900 hours. It was to be broadcast live to the stellar accord, a diplomatic spectacle intended to prove that the two most dangerous species in the galaxy could share a room without killing each other. Adrian Cole sat in his makeshift office at the back of the war tent, staring at a wall of monitors. His eyes were red-rimmed. He had not slept in 36 hours. On the screens, the preparations looked festive. Banners of silk and woven steel hung from the tent poles. Tables were set with nutrient cakes and Nerian spiced meat. It looked like a party, but to Adrian, it looked like a kill box. For the past week, the accidents had escalated. A power surge in the medical bay, a structural support bolt snapping in the mess hall, a localized failure of the oxygen scrubbers in the Nerian barracks. They were dismissed as the growing pains of a hasty infrastructure, consequences of building a peace camp on a bombed-out moon. But Adrian Cole was not looking at the incidents. He was looking at the data. He pulled up a holographic timeline. He overlaid the incidents with the VIP arrival schedules, the press briefing times, and the guard rotation shifts. He closed his eyes, letting his mind drift away from the role of the gentle coordinator and back into the cold, sharp architecture of the strategist. He let the data become a landscape. He looked for the rhythm. Tick. A power failure exactly 4 minutes before the human ambassador landed. Tick. A water main break occurred exactly 2 minutes after the Nerian High Priestess began her prayer. Tick. It was a frequency. A pulse. "It is not random," Adrian whispered to the empty room. "It is a heartbeat." Sire. He began to type his fingers, flying across the interface. He bypassed the standard security protocol's clumsy, civilian firewalls that were insults to his skill set and dug into the maintenance logs. He traced the command packets that had triggered the accidents. They were routed through 3 dummy servers, bouncing off a satellite relay in orbit to mask their origin. Standard counterintelligence weaving. Competent but textbook. Adrian reverse engineered the signal. He stripped away the masking layers one by one. It took him 2 hours. When he finally isolated the source code, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the lunar climate. The authorization codes belonged to the security subgrid, specifically a localized node accessible only by 2 high-ranking officers, Colonel Jace Ward and Captain Targle. Adrian sat back, his breath trembling in his chest. He had the who. Now he needed what. He tapped into the internal audio sensors of the security hub, the very sensors Ward thought he had disabled. Adrian had reactivated them remotely 6 hours ago, a paranoid precaution that was now paying off. The audio file was grainy, distorted by static, but the voices were unmistakable. "The payload is calibrated for non-lethal shock," Ward's voice cut through the hiss. "Sonic emitters are set to the frequency of an orbital siren. Strobe pulses at 12 Hz. Chemical dispersion of synthesized cordite. It mimics the sensory profile of the bombardment of Sector 9. Targle's deep, growling voice replied. "It will not kill them." "No," Ward agreed. "It will just remind them. The humans will panic and reach for their sidearms. The Nerians will go feral and deploy claws. It will be a riot on live television. The bond will be seen for what it is, a fragile delusion. The funding gets pulled, the tent gets closed, and we go back to maintaining a proper perimeter." "Honor requires memory," Targle added. "They are forgetting the dead too fast. We will give them a nightmare they cannot sleep through." Adrian slammed his hand down on the console to stop the recording. They were not planning a bombing. They were planning a psychological trigger event. They were going to turn the war tent into a sensory reenactment of the worst days of the war, banking on the PTSD of 2,000 veterans to tear the peace apart from the inside. It was brilliant. It was monstrous. And it was scheduled to trigger in 4 hours. Adrian stood up, grabbing his datapad. He had to stop it. He could go to the military police, but Ward controlled the MP rotation. He could go to the press, but that would cause the very panic Ward wanted. He had to go to Nera. But to convince Nera that this was real, to explain how he had cracked a military-grade encryption and predicted a psychological operation strike, he would have to tell her the truth. He would have to tell her that he was not Adrian Cole, the bumbling therapy coordinator. He was Adrian Cole, the architect of the starvation siege. He looked at his reflection in the dark monitor. He looked like a ghost. "Well," Adrian whispered, "you wanted to heal her. Sometimes you have to cut the wound open to get the poison out." The war tent was empty, save for General Naira. She was standing before the central pillar, polishing the ceremonial breastplate she would wear for the broadcast. The amber light of the tent caught the scars on her arms, turning them into maps of survival. She smelled him before she saw him. Her ears swiveled back, and she did not turn around. "You are vibrating, Adrian," she said, her voice calm. "Your heart rate is 120 beats per minute. Are you nervous about the speech? Or did you accidentally propose to a Klingon diplomat this time?" "Naira," Adrian said. His voice was steady, stripped of all humor. "We need to talk, now." Naira turned. She saw his face, and the playful glint in her eyes vanished instantly. She set the armor down. "What is it? Has the Council canceled the event?" "No," Adrian said. "The event is the trap." He walked over to the hollow table and placed his datapad on the surface. He projected the schematics. He had uncovered the placement of the sonic emitters hidden in the rafters, the chemical canisters rigged into the ventilation system, the strobe arrays masked as stage lighting. "Colonel Ward and Captain Targle," Adrian explained, pointing to the nodes. "They have rigged the tent. At the climax of the ceremony, when the anthem plays, they are going to trigger a sensory overload. It is designed to simulate a hull breach and orbital bombardment. They want to trigger a mass panic response." Naira stared at the schematic. Her claws extended slowly, scratching against the metal table. "Targle," she hissed. "He would risk the honor of the clan for this?" "He thinks he is saving the clan," Adrian said. "He thinks peace is a form of forgetting. He wants to prove that we are still enemies." Naira looked up at him. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. "This data," she said. "This is high-level encryption. These are patterns buried in the noise of the grid. How did you find this, Adrian? You are a coordinator. You organize breathing circles and finger painting." This was it. The precipice. Adrian took a deep breath. He felt the air leaving his lungs, and he wondered if he would ever breathe easily again. "I am not just a coordinator," he said. "During the war, I was a senior strategic analyst for the 7th Intelligence Division." Naira went very still. The air in the tent seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Go on," she said softly. "My specialty was predictive logistics and resource denial." Adrian continued, forcing himself to look her in the eye. "I built models. I looked for patterns in supply lines, in morale and consumption rates." He paused. "I wrote the algorithm for the Sector 4 blockade, the starvation siege." The silence that followed was louder than any explosion. Naira stared at him. Her face did not change, but her pupils dilated until her eyes were almost entirely black. She took a step back, as if he had suddenly transmuted into a monster. "You," she whispered. The word came out like a curse. "I did not know the specifics of who was on the ground," Adrian pleaded, the words tasting like ash. "I just saw the numbers, efficiency rates, attrition probabilities. But when I saw the reports, when I saw the images of what starvation did to your soldiers, I resigned. I wiped my records. I came here to try and fix what I broke." "Fix it!" Naira's voice rose, cracking with a fury that shook the tent. "You starved my people. I watched my soldiers boil leather to eat. I watched them fade away until they were too weak to lift their rifles. And you were sitting in a room doing math." She lunged. It was a blur of motion. Adrian flinched, but she did not strike him. She stopped inches from his face, her hand slamming into the hollow table, shattering the projection. "I trusted you," she snarled, her breath hot on his face. "I let you into my tent. I let you speak to my ghosts. And all this time you were the one who created them." "Naira, please," Adrian said, tears stinging his eyes. "The attack. We have to stop the attack." "Get out," Naira said. She turned her back to him. Her shoulders were shaking. "Naira, Ward is going to—" "I will deal with Ward," she roared, spinning back around. "I will deal with my own traitor. But if I see you when the ceremony starts, Adrian Cole, I will not see a partner. I will see an enemy combatant. And I will act accordingly." She pointed to the exit. "Leave, before I remember that I am a general of the Dominion and tear your throat out." Adrian stood there for a second, his heart shattered on the floor. Then he turned and walked out into the blinding light of the lunar afternoon. 1900 hours. The war tent was packed, 2,000 souls, humans in dress blues, Nerians in ceremonial armor. The air was thick with the scent of incense and anticipation. The cameras were rolling, broadcasting to 12 systems. Adrian stood at the very back in the shadows of the tech booth. He was not supposed to be there. He was supposed to be on stage, standing next to Naira. But his chair on the dais was empty. Naira stood alone at the podium. She looked magnificent and terrifying. She wore her full armor, the metals of her campaigns gleaming under the lights. but her face was a mask of stone. She scanned the crowd, her eyes darting to the vents, to the lights. She had clearly tried to disable the devices, but Ward must have had a failsafe, or perhaps she hadn't found them all in time. Or perhaps she didn't care anymore. Colonel Ward sat in the front row looking solemn and patriotic. He checked his wrist chrono. Adrian checked his own. 2 minutes. He scanned the room. He saw the tension in the shoulders of the veterans. They were calm, but fragile, like glass that had been glued back together. One vibration and they would shatter. "Come on, Nira," Adrian whispered. "Call it off. Evacuate the tent." But she didn't. She began to speak. Her voice was strong but hollow. "We gather here," Nira said, "to remember that honor is not found in the kill, but in the survival." She paused. She looked at the empty chair beside her. For a split second, the mask slipped and Adrian saw a flash of profound, crushing loneliness. Then the lights flickered. It started with a low hum, a subsonic vibration that hit the stomach before the ears. Infrasound, the fear frequency. Then the strobe lights triggered. Violent, blinding flashes of white and red pulsing at 12 hertz. It was disorienting, nauseating. Then came the sound. It wasn't a siren. It was worse. It was a synthesized recording of a screamer missile, the signature weapon of the human orbital fleets, mixed with the guttural roar of a Nerian drop pod breaching atmosphere. It was the sound of death approaching from above. And finally, the smell. The vents blasted a cloud of gray smoke that smelled of burning ozone cordite and copper blood. Chaos. It was instantaneous. "Incoming!" a human marine screamed, diving under a table. "Breach, breach!" A Nerian warrior roared his claws, extending, slashing at the air. The crowd disintegrated. The carefully arranged rows of chairs were kicked aside. Veterans who had spent 30 days learning to breathe were suddenly back in the trenches. "Secure the perimeter!" Colonel Ward shouted, standing up and drawing a concealed sidearm. "They are attacking! The Nerians are attacking!" "Traitors!" Captain Targle bellowed from the other side. "Defend the general!" It was working. The panic was morphing into aggression. A human grabbed a chair to use as a club. A Nerian prepared to pounce on a cowering diplomat. The cameras were capturing it all, the failure of the peace, the return to savagery. Adrian watched the pattern unfold. He saw the vectors of panic. He saw the collapsing center. He could run. He could leave and let it burn. He deserved to leave. But he looked at the stage. Naira was shouting orders, but no one could hear her over the screeching audio. She looked small against the backdrop of chaos. She looked overwhelmed. Adrian Cole had spent his life looking at patterns of death. For the first time, he saw a pattern of life. He saw the way the panic was moving. It wasn't hatred. It was fear. Pure, unadulterated fear. He didn't think so. He didn't calculate. He acted. He sprinted from the shadows, bypassing the stunned technicians. He slammed his hand onto the main audio console. He didn't cut the sound. Ward had locked the system. Instead, he grabbed the master microphone. He cranked the gain to maximum. "Eyes on me!" His voice boomed through the speakers, distorted and deafening, cutting through the synthesized scream of the missiles. The shock of the volume made a few people freeze. "Do not fight it!" Adrian screamed, his voice raw. "Listen to the sound!" He jumped onto the tech table, making himself visible above the crowd. "It is a simulation," Adrian yelled, dropping his voice into the rhythmic cadence he used for the breathing exercises. "It is a memory. You are not in the trench. You are in the tent. Look at your feet, look at the ground." A few soldiers looked down. "The ground is solid," Adrian commanded. "The air is safe. Close your eyes right now. Close them." He was channeling every ounce of command authority he had buried. He wasn't the logistics officer now. He was the voice of God in their headsets. The smell is just smoke, Adrian said, his voice dropping to a fierce, steady rhythm. The sound is just a recording. You have survived this already. You survived the real thing. This is just an echo. He saw a human marine, hyperventilating, holding a knife. He saw a Nyrian warrior crouched to spring. Find the hand of the person next to you, Adrian ordered. I do not care if it has skin or fur, grab it. Squeeze it, anchor them. The marine hesitated. The Nyrian hesitated. Do it! Adrian roared. The marine reached out blindly. His hand found the furry arm of the Nyrian. The Nyrian snarled, but didn't strike. He grabbed the human's hand. Now, Adrian said, his voice softening, becoming a chant. The noise is not an attack. It is a salute. It is the sound of what we survived. Let it wash over you. You are the stone in the river. The water moves, the stone stays. The strobe lights were still flashing, the sirens were still screaming, but the movement in the room had stopped. The violence had been arrested. People were standing in the chaos, holding hands, eyes, squeezed shut, shaking, crying but standing. Adrian looked up at the stage. Nira was staring at him. Her eyes were wide. She saw what he was doing. He was taking the panic, the raw energy of the fight-or-flight response, and channeling it into a ritual. He was rewriting the context of the stimulus in real time. She stepped forward to her own microphone. Warriors of the Dominion. Nira's voice rang out, harmonizing with Adrian's. Stand down. Do not let the shadows trick you. You are the third claw. You do not fear the noise. She looked at Ward, who was standing with his gun drawn, looking confused and impotent. Look at them, Nira commanded the room. Look at those who wish to scare you. They are small. They are afraid. But we are here. She raised her fist. We are here. We are here. The crowd roared back a mixture of human and Nyrian voices. The panic broke. It didn't disappear. It transformed. The adrenaline that was meant for murder became defiance. The soldiers weren't fighting each other. They were fighting the manipulation. The sirens wailed on, but they lost their power. They became background noise to a chant that started low and grew louder. Loomis. Loomis, Loomis! It was the name of the moon, the name of the peace. Adrian slumped against the console. His legs gave out. He slid down to the floor, the microphone slipping from his hand. He watched as the military police, the ones not loyal to Ward, finally breached the doors and tackled Colonel Ward and Captain Targle. The strobe lights finally died. The sirens cut out, replaced by the heavy, wet sound of 2,000 people breathing in unison. It was over. Adrian sat on the floor, surrounded by tangled cables. He felt hollow. He had saved the tent. He had saved the ceremony. But he knew, with a certainty that made his chest ache, that he had lost the only thing that mattered. He saw boots approach him. Heavy, scarred combat boots. He looked up. Nyra stood over him. The adrenaline was fading from her system, leaving her trembling. Her eyes were still dark, swirling with a storm of emotions he couldn't read. Anger, yes. Betrayal, definitely. But there was something else, a question. You stayed, Nyra said. Her voice was rough. I told you to leave. I told you I would treat you as an enemy. I know, Adrian croaked. He tried to stand, but his knees were water. But the pattern was heading toward a massacre. I couldn't let the math win. Not this time. Nira looked at him, really. Looked at him for a long time. She saw the exhaustion, the guilt, the desperate need to make amends that went deeper than any algorithm. She reached out a hand. Her claws were retracted. Get up, strategist, she said. We are not done yet. Adrian stared at her hand. He hesitated. Take it, she growled softly. Before I change my mind. Adrian reached up and grasped her hand. Her grip was iron-strong. She pulled him to his feet, effortlessly. They stood there, in the quiet of the tech booth, the sounds of the recovering crowd washing over them. The bond between them was fractured, scarred, and ugly. But it was there, and like the moon of Loomis, perhaps it could survive being bombed. "Warden Targal," Adrian asked. "In custody," Naira said. "They failed, because they calculated for soldiers. They did not calculate for whatever this is." "Survivors," Adrian said. "Survivors," Naira agreed. She released his hand, but she didn't step away. "Go to your quarters, Adrian. Sleep. Tomorrow we will see if there is anything left to salvage." She turned and walked back toward her people, her cape swirling in the settling dust. Adrian watched her go. He was alive. The war tent was standing. It was a start. The days following the convergence of memory were a blur of contradictions. The broadcast had been a sensation. Across the stellar accord, viewers had tuned in expecting a polite, diplomatic handshake, and had instead witnessed a raw, terrifying, and ultimately transcendent moment of collective survival. The image of Adrian Cole standing on a table, screaming for unity, over the wail of sirens, and General Nira Karras, rallying her troops to stand firm against fear, played on loop on every newsfeed from Terra to the Outer Rim. Commentators called it the scream heard across the galaxy. They called it the most honest moment in 50 years of politics. But on Loomis, the mood was more fragile. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind the bruising ache of reality. The investigation into Colonel Ward and Captain Targal was swift and brutal. The revelation that high-ranking officers had conspired to traumatize their own troops to sabotage peace caused a shockwave of anger that threatened to turn into a riot. Adrian sat in his office packing a box. He moved slowly, his hands trembling slightly, as he folded his few civilian tunics. "You are leaving," Dr. Harper Lynn said from the doorway. It was not a question. "I have to," Adrian said without looking up. "The council is debating whether to shut us down. They say the security breach proves the war tent is a liability. If I stay, if Naira finds out the full extent of my history, it will not just be a liability. It will be a scandal that buries everything we built." "Naira knows you were an analyst," Harper said, stepping into the room. "She knows I wrote an algorithm," Adrian corrected, his voice tight. "She does not know I was the one who signed the deployment order. She does not know I watched the famine spread on satellite feeds and called it optimal efficiency. I am not a healer, Harper. I am a ghost trying to wear a human suit." He placed a framed photo of his sister, the one person he had tried to protect, by ending the war quickly, face down in the box. "You saved them, Adrian," Harper said softly. "On that stage, you saved everyone." "I saved the project," Adrian said. "But I cannot save myself. It is better if I go. Let them bring in someone clean, someone whose hands do not have invisible blood on them." In the war tent, Nira Karras walked the perimeter alone. The air still smelled faintly of the chemical smoke from the attack, a bitter reminder of the betrayal. She stopped at the memorial wall. The red paint had been scrubbed away, but the fabric was still stained a faint pink. She traced the face of a young Nerian soldier in a photograph. He looked terrified. She remembered the way Adrian had looked at her in the tech booth, the desperate pleading in his eyes. "I resigned. I wiped my records." She remembered the feeling of his hand in hers, sweaty, shaking, but holding on with a strength that surprised her. Nira closed her eyes. She felt the old anger, the hot, sharp rage that had kept her alive through 3 years of siege trying to rise. It wanted to burn Adrian Cole. It wanted to brand him a monster and cast him out. But then she remembered the sound of the breathing in the tent. 2,000 people, enemies by birth, holding hands in the dark because a human voice told them they were safe. "If I send him away," Naira whispered to the empty room. "I am just finishing Targal's work for him." She opened her eyes. The amber glow was steady. She tapped her comms unit. "Cole, report to the war tent. Immediately." Adrian arrived 10 minutes later. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. He had not shaved, and there were dark circles under his eyes that looked like bruises. He stood at the entrance, hesitating. "Come in," Nira called from the center of the tent. She had set up 2 cushions on the floor facing each other. Between them sat a small, low table with a single candle burning. "Sit," she commanded. Adrian sat. He kept his eyes on the floor. "General, I assume you have processed my resignation request." "I have processed nothing," Nira said. She sat opposite him, her knees almost touching his. "Look at me, Adrian." He looked up. Her eyes were not angry. They were terrifyingly clear. "I am angry with you," Nira said. Her voice was level void of the growl he expected. "I have the right to be. You were the architect of my nightmares. When I close my eyes, I see the faces of the starving because of math you wrote on a whiteboard." Adrian flinched as if she had struck him. "I know. That is why I am leaving. You deserve a partner who—" "Stop," Nira cut him off. "Stop deciding what I deserve, and stop deciding what this camp needs based on your own guilt." She leaned forward. "You stood on that table. You shouted down the fear. You held the line when my own officers broke. You think you can just pack a box and walk away? You think that absolves you? That is cowardice, Adrian. It is easier to run and be the tragic villain than to stay and do the work." Adrian stared at her, his mouth slightly open. "I am not trying to be a villain. I am trying to protect you. If people find out—" "People will find out," Nira said. "Eventually. The truth always digs its way out. The question is, who will you be when they do? Will you be the man who ran away, or the man who stayed to fix the damage?" Adrian felt a lump form in his throat, hard and painful. "I do not know if I can fix it. I look at my hands, Nira, and I see the numbers. I see the casualty lists." "Then look at me," Nira ordered. She reached up and unclasped the collar of her tunic. She pulled the fabric down, revealing a jagged silvery scar that ran across her collarbone. "This is from a shrapnel burst in Sector 7, she said. "I ordered my squad to advance into fire. 3 of them died. I lived. That is my number." She pointed to the scar on her face. "This is from a knife fight with a human marine. I killed him. He was a boy. He cried for his mother before he died. That is my number." She looked straight into Adrian's soul. "We are all made of number strategists. We are all made of the dead we carry. The bond of wounds is not about finding someone innocent. There are no innocent people in a war. It is about finding someone strong enough to help you carry the weight." Adrian felt a tear slide down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. "I am afraid," he whispered. "I am afraid that I am unforgivable." "You might be," Nira said brutally. "But forgiveness is not a switch you flip. It is a road, and you cannot walk it if you leave." She pushed a small bowl of water across the table toward him. "This is the right of the mirror," she said. "In the old ways, warriors would wash the paint of war from each other's faces. We have no paint, but we have scars. Show me yours." Adrian hesitated. Then slowly, he rolled up his sleeve. On his forearm was a small, pale burn mark. It wasn't from combat. It was from a soldering iron, an accident from when he was fixing a radio to call for medevac, for a captured Nerian pilot he had found. It was the only time during the war he had directly saved a life with his hands. "I tried to fix his comms," Adrian said, his voice trembling. "He died anyway. But I tried." Nira reached out and dipped her fingers in the water. She touched the burn mark on his arm. The water was cool. Her touch was gentle. "You tried," she repeated. She took his hand and placed it in the water. "Now me." Adrian dipped his fingers. He reached out and touched the scar on her cheek. The fur was coarse, the skin beneath it rigid. He felt the pulse beating in her jaw. "I am sorry," he whispered. "For hunger, for the cold, for everything." "I hear you," Nira said. She didn't say, "I forgive you." She said, "I hear you." It was enough. They sat there for a long time in the quiet of the tent, two former enemies washing the invisible ash from each other's skin. Outside the tent, the camp was changing. The attack had broken something, but not in the way Ward had intended. It had broken the polite diplomatic distance between the two species. In the mess hall, a group of human Marines and Nerian scouts were sitting together. They weren't holding hands or singing songs. They were arguing about engine specs on their respective transport ships. It was mundane. It was normal. In the courtyard, a group of veterans had gathered. They had started a new project unauthorized but tolerated by the MPs. They were writing letters. "What is this?" Adrian asked the next day, walking through the group. "Letters to the dead, sir," a young private said. "We write down what we wish we had said. Then we burn them in the Nerian fire pits." The elder says the smoke carries the words. Adrian watched as a burly Nerian warrior handed a piece of paper to a human soldier. The human couldn't read Nerian script, but he nodded solemnly and threw it into the fire. "It works," the Nerian grunted. "The chest feels lighter." The war tent itself was transforming. It was no longer just a museum of the past. It was becoming a workshop for the future. Nera organized a reforestation committee. The crater floor of Loomis was dead rock, but the terraforming units were beginning to pump nitrogen into the soil. "We will plant the ironwood seeds here," Nera explained, pointing to a map. "They grow in harsh soil. Their roots bind the earth together." "And here," Adrian added, pointing to the perimeter, "we can set up hydroponic gardens, food grown on the battlefield. It is symbolic." They worked side by side. There was a new ease between them. The tension of the secret was gone, replaced by a cautious working trust. They didn't joke as much, but when they did, it felt earned. The trial of Colonel Ward and Captain Targle was held 3 days later. The council wanted a show trial. They wanted to execute them for treason or lock them away in a dark site for life. Adrian and Nera stood before the tribunal as joint witnesses. "They are guilty," Nera stated clearly. "They betrayed their troops. They dishonored the uniform." "However," Adrian stepped in, "we do not recommend incarceration." The human High Counselor looked baffled. "Mr. Cole, they tried to induce a psychotic break in 2,000 soldiers. You want to let them go?" "No," Adrian said. "I want them to work." He looked at Ward, who was sitting in the prisoner dock, looking defiant but tired. "The war tent operates on the principle of restorative justice," Adrian said. "You cannot heal a wound by hiding the knife. You have to clean it." "We propose," Nera continued, "that Colonel Ward and Captain Targle be remanded to the custody of the peace camp. They will not be commanders. They will be participants. They will attend every circle. They will listen to every story. Specifically, they will listen to the soldiers who were in the tent during their attack." Ward looked horrified. "I would rather be court-martialed," he spat. "Exactly," Adrian said calmly. "Prison is easy for men like you. You can sit in a cell and convince yourself you are a martyr. But looking into the eyes of the people you hurt, that is hard. That is punishment." The council deliberated for an hour. In the end, they agreed. It was a politically savvy move. It avoided creating martyrs for the hardliners and reinforced the camp's philosophy. Ward and Targle were stripped of their ranks. They were given gray tunics, same as the new recruits. The first time Ward sat in the circle, the silence was deafening. A young corporal with a tremor in his hand looked at the former colonel. "I trusted you," the corporal said. "I thought you were protecting us. When the sirens went off, I almost stabbed my friend." "Because of you," Ward didn't answer. He looked at the floor, but he stayed. He had no choice. And slowly, day by day, the defiance began to crack, replaced by the crushing weight of shame. 32 days became 40. 40 became 60. The trial period of the bond was officially over. The Council had quietly extended the mandate of the war tent indefinitely. They called it the Loomis Protocol. One evening Adrian found Nira in the tent. She was standing on a ladder, hanging a new tapestry from the central pole. It was a massive piece of fabric woven by the veterans. It depicted the crater of Loomis, but instead of gray rock, it was painted in vibrant greens and blues. Trees grew from shell casings. Water flowed from bunkers. "It is optimistic," Adrian noted, steadying the ladder. "It is a target," Nira said, climbing down. She dusted off her hands. "It is what we are aiming for." She looked at Adrian. She seemed different lately. The sharp edges of her armor seemed less like a cage and more like a uniform she could take off. "The Elder says our contract is up," Nira said. "The 32 days are finished. You are free to go, Adrian. You can go back to Earth. You can find a nice, quiet job in logistics for a shipping company. No ghosts." Adrian looked around the tent. He saw the candles flickering. He saw the letters waiting to be burned. He saw Ward in the corner, sweeping the floor with a humility that felt genuine. "I do not think I would be good at shipping," Adrian said. "I have developed a taste for herbal tea and impossible odds." Nira smiled. It was a small thing, but it reached her eyes. "I still have not forgiven you completely," she said. "There are days I look at you and I still see the strategist." "I know," Adrian said. "There are days I look in the mirror and see him too. But," Nira continued, stepping closer, "I choose to let tomorrow be decided by what we do today. Not by what you did yesterday." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a data chip. "What is this?" Adrian asked. "My playlist," Nira said. "It is traditional Nerian throat singing, mixed with some of that terrible ambient noise you like." "I made it," Adrian laughed, taking the chip. "You made a mixtape, General. Are you wooing me?" Nira's whiskers twitched in amusement. "I am making a tactical exchange of cultural assets. Do not read into it." "Right," Adrian grinned. "Tactical. Stay, Adrian," Nira said softly. "We have a lot of trees to plant." "I am staying," Adrian promised. They stood together under the new tapestry, looking out at the open flap of the tent. Outside, the first shoots of the terraformed grass were pushing up through the gray dust, impossibly green, impossibly alive. The war was over. The healing had just begun. But for the first time in a long time, Adrian Cole looked at the future and didn't see a pattern of loss. He saw a garden. The second moon of Loomis hung low in the sky, a pale, cratered eye, watching over the camp. It was the night of the new cycle. In the Nerian calendar, this was the time when the old year was burned away, and the new year was forged in the ash. The war tent had been transformed yet again. The chaotic debris of the attack from weeks ago had been cleared. The defensive barricades were gone. In their place stood rows of simple wooden benches, hand-carved by the veterans from the wreckage of ammunition crates. The lighting was no longer the harsh, interrogating glare of the command center, nor the dim, frightened flicker of the early days. It was a steady, warm illumination provided by hundreds of bioluminescent lanterns, a fusion of Nerian organic tech and human engineering. Tonight was not a celebration. It was a reckoning. Adrian Cole stood in the preparation area behind the main dais. He was wearing his gray tunic, unadorned by medals or rank. He felt light, but it was the terrifying lightness of a man who was about to jump off a cliff. "You do not have to do this," Dr. Harperlin said. She was adjusting the collar of his tunic, her fingers lingering worriedly on the fabric. "The Council is happy with the current narrative. You are the hero who stopped the panic. Ward is the villain. It is a clean story. Why dirty it?" "Because a clean story is a lie," Adrian said softly. "And we built this place to stop lying about the war." He looked at his reflection in the polished surface of a deactivated drone. He looked older than his 35 years. The gray in his hair had spread and the lines around his eyes were etched deep. But for the first time in years, the haunted look, the look of a man constantly checking the exits, was gone. "If I stay here as the hero coordinator," Adrian explained, "I am building a foundation on rot. Eventually the floor will give way. Naira deserves better. The veterans deserve better. They need to know who is actually leading them." "They might tear you apart," Harper warned. "Mob mentality is a fragile thing, Adrian. You saw how quickly they turned during the siren attack." "If they tear me apart," Adrian said, buttoning his cuff, "then that is the judgment I earned." The curtain to the main stage parted. General Nira Karras stepped in. She was not wearing her armor tonight. She wore a long ceremonial robe of deep midnight blue, embroidered with silver threads that traced the constellations of the homeworld she had fought to protect. She looked at Harper. "Doctor, give us a moment." Harper nodded, squeezed Adrian's arm once, and left. Naira turned to Adrian. Her amber eyes were calm, but there was a storm of emotion swirling in their depths. She reached out and brushed a speck of dust from his shoulder. "The tent is full," she said. Her voice is low. 3,000 people. The overflow crowd is watching on screens outside. The global news network is broadcasting live to Earth and Prime. "Good," Adrian said. His stomach did not agree. It felt like he had swallowed a bag of rocks. "No secrets." "Adrian," Naira said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Once you say the words, you cannot say them. You are handing them a weapon. You are handing my people a weapon to hurt you." "I know," Adrian said. "Why?" Naira asked. "You could leave. You could retire. We could keep the secret." "Because of the bond," Adrian replied, meeting her gaze. "The bond of wounds is about carrying the truth together. If I make you carry my secret alone, Naira, I am not your partner. I am just another burden." Naira stared at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. It was a sharp military nod, but her ears softened. "Then let us go," she said. "I will stand on your right. I will not shield you, but I will not leave you." The hush that fell over the war tent when they walked onto the stage was absolute. It was a heavy silence, thick with expectation. The air smelled of damp earth from the new planting beds and the sharp tang of anticipation. Adrian walked to the podium. He did not use a translator. He had spent the last 2 weeks practicing his high Nerian pronunciation, though he would speak in common for the broadcast. He gripped the edges of the podium. His knuckles were white. "Veterans of Loomis," Adrian began. His voice shook slightly, then steadied. "Citizens of the Accord, for 42 days we have gathered here to heal. We have shared our nightmares. We have shared our grief." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. He saw Varric, the scarred Nerian warrior, sitting in the front row. He saw the young human corporal who had lost his leg. "But healing requires a clean wound," Adrian continued. "And I have let an infection fester." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "You know me as the coordinator," Adrian said. "You know me as the man who organizes the art therapy and the breathing circles. You know me as the man who made a foolish joke about a microphone." A few weak chuckles from the back quickly stifled. "But before I was Adrian Cole the healer," he said, "I was Senior Analyst Cole of the 7th Strategic Division." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The temperature seemed to drop. The 7th Division was infamous. They were the cold logic behind the war's cruelest attrition tactics. "I did not fire a rifle," Adrian said, his voice hard and clear. "I did not pilot a dropship. My weapon was mathematics. My battlefield was a spreadsheet." He took a deep breath. 6 years ago, during the stalemate in Sector 4, the human high command needed a way to break the Nerian defenses without a direct assault. They asked for a solution that minimized human casualties. I gave them one. He saw Nira stiffen beside him, but she did not look away. I designed the algorithm for the resource blockade, Adrian confessed. I calculated the exact caloric intake of the Nerian garrison. I calculated the water filtration failure rates. I wrote the code that routed the supply drones away from the civilian centers, creating a starvation pocket that forced the surrender. The silence in the tent was now a physical thing. It was a vacuum sucking the air out of the room. I know the name of that campaign, Adrian said. You call it the Starvation Siege. I called it Project Gilded Cage. I sat in a bunker 3,000 miles away, and I watched the thermal signatures of your people fade as they grew colder and weaker. And I told myself I was being efficient. I told myself I was shortening the war. Monster! A voice cried out from the middle rows. It was a Nerian woman. She stood up, her fur bristling, tears streaming down her face. My brother died in Sector 4. He ate the leather of his boots. He died screaming for water. I know, Adrian said. He did not flinch. I am responsible for his death. I am responsible for the deaths of 4,312 soldiers and civilians. He recited the number from memory. He had never forgotten it. I am not asking for forgiveness, Adrian said to the weeping woman. I have no right to ask for that. I am telling you this because I cannot ask you to trust this war tent or to trust the peace we are building if it is built on a lie. I am the architect of your pain, and I am sorry. He stepped back from the podium. The room erupted. It wasn't a riot, but it was close. Shouts of anger, cries of betrayal. A human veteran looked at Adrian with disgust. We thought you were one of us, Cole. You were just a spook in a suit. Varric stood up, his hand resting on the hilt of his ceremonial dagger. He looked at Adrian with a mixture of confusion and rage. You broke the supply lines. You are the starvation ghost. Nira stepped forward. She raised her hand. She did not shout, but her presence demanded obedience. Silence! The roar of the crowd died down to a simmering murmur. You have heard the truth, Nira said, her voice cutting like a blade. Adrian Cole has stripped his soul bare before you. He has handed you the knife. Now, she paused. Now, before you strike, a new voice interrupted. You will hear the rest of the file. It was Elder Sereth. The ancient Nerian walked slowly onto the stage, leaning on his staff. Beside him walked a human administrative officer, carrying a data drive. What is this? Adrian whispered to Nira. I told them everything. You told them what you remember through your guilt, Nira murmured. The Elder remembers what the history logs say. Elder Sereth plugged the drive into the holographic table. A large projection appeared in the air above the crowd. It was a complex web of supply routes and code streams, the architecture of the Starvation Siege. We have recently petitioned the Human Archives for the full declassification of the Sector 4 event, Elder Sereth announced. It seems there was an anomaly in the final days of the siege. The hologram zoomed in on a specific sector of the blockade. A red line representing the kill zone flashed. On the 42nd day of the siege, Sereth narrated, a convoy of 3 civilian transport trains attempted to break the blockade to evacuate the wounded and the children. The automated turrets controlled by the algorithm targeted them. The kill probability was 100%. Adrian watched the screen, his heart hammering. He remembered that night. He remembered the flashing red lights on his console. However, Sereth continued, the turrets did not fire, the crowd murmured. The log shows a catastrophic system error, Sereth said. A ghost gap appeared in the targeting grid. For exactly 12 minutes, the blockade went blind. The trains escaped. Were. Sereth turned to the human officer. Play the audio log from the control bunker. Timestamp 0300 hours. A burst of static filled the tent. Then a voice. It was younger, sharper, but unmistakably Adrian's. "Sir, I am registering a targeting lock on the civilian convoy. They are non-combatants." A second voice, a superior officer, replied. "They are in the denial zone, analyst. The algorithm dictates total containment. Let the machine do its job." The sound of typing frantic, heavy keystrokes echoed through the speakers. "Analyst Cole, what are you doing?" "The grid is destabilizing." Adrian's voice came back strained and breathless. "It is a glitch, sir. I can't hold it. The code is eating itself. I have to reboot the local node." "Do not reboot, that will open the corridor." "Oops," Adrian's voice said. It wasn't a mistake. It was a defiant, terrified whisper. "System crashing. Rebooting now." The audio is cut to static. The war tent was silent again. But it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of people trying to rearrange their understanding of the world. Elder Sereth looked at Adrian. "You did not resign because you were tired, Adrian Cole. You were discharged. You were stripped of your clearance and threatened with court-martial for gross incompetence. You let them think you were incompetent, rather than admit you were compassionate." Sereth turned to the crowd. "The train that escaped carried 2,000 civilians. Children, elders, the wounded." Adrian stared at the floor. He felt naked. "I didn't save enough," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I let the siege happen. I only opened the door at the end. It wasn't enough." Naira turned to him. Her face was unreadable. She walked over to the holographic display and touched the image of the escaping train. "My cousin was on that train," she said softly. Adrian looked up, shock registering on his face. "What?" Alara Naira said. "She was a medic. She was wounded, carrying her newborn. She told me later that the sky was full of human turrets, but they stood silent like metal trees. She thought it was a miracle from the ancestors." Naira turned to face the crowd. Tears were shimmering in her bioluminescent eyes, but she did not let them fall. "I hated the strategist," Naira declared, her voice ringing out to the back of the tent. "I wanted to hunt him down and tear out his throat for the hunger he caused. Today, I found out that this strategist is the man who has been pouring tea for me for 60 days. She walked over to Adrian. She did not stop until she was standing inside his personal space. "You are a paradox, Adrian Cole," she said. "You built the cage and then you broke the lock. You are both the monster and the savior." She reached out and took his hand. She raised it high in the air. "This is the reality of war," Naira shouted to her people. "There are no pure heroes. There are only people who make terrible choices and then spend the rest of their lives trying to fix them. Adrian Cole chose to save my kin when it cost him his career. He chose to come here to this rock to face the ghosts he made." She looked at the Nerian woman, who had screamed earlier. "You have the right to hate him," Naira said. "But I have the right to stand with him. Because he did not run away. He is here carrying the dirt to fill the craters." Naira turned to Adrian, her voice softening for his ears alone. "I accept the bond of wounds, Adrian, not as a trial, not for 32 days, but for life. We will carry the dead together, your ghosts and mine." For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly, the sound of a single person clapping began. It was the human corporal with the prosthetic leg. He stood up, balancing on his good leg. Then Varric stood up. The scarred Nerian warrior looked at Adrian, nodded, once a gesture of profound respect, and began to beat his fist against his chest plate. A rhythmic, thumping sound. The Nerian applause of honor. One by one the tent rose. Humans and Nerians. The sound grew a mixture of clapping and chest thumping until it sounded like a heartbeat, loud and strong and alive. Adrian stood there, tears finally spilling down his face. His hand gripped tight in Naira's. He felt the weight of the last 6 years begin to lift, not gone, but shared. The weeks that followed the truth ceremony changed everything. The council, seeing the overwhelming support from the veterans and the public, officially chartered the war tent as the Interspecies Center for Reconciliation. They approved the construction of 5 more centers on other contested worlds, using the Loomis model. Adrian and Nira were not fired. They were promoted. They were named the High Custodians of the Reconciliation Network. But titles mattered little on Loomis. What mattered was the work. 6 months later, the crater of Loomis was unrecognizable. The terraforming project had taken root with aggressive speed. The gray dust was covered in a carpet of hardy violet-green moss. Saplings of ironwood trees stood in rows, their leaves drinking in the artificial atmosphere. Adrian sat on a bench outside the war tent, watching a group of new arrivals. It was a mixed group, fresh-faced human recruits and young Nerian cadets who had come to learn about the history of the war, not from textbooks, but from the people who fought it. Colonel Ward, now just Jace, was leading the group. He looked different. He had lost weight, but he looked healthier. He was pointing to the memorial wall, explaining the significance of a Nerian clan badge to a human teenager. "He is actually a good teacher," Adrian observed. "He has a lot to atone for," Nira said, sitting down beside him. "Penance makes for a thorough instructor." She handed him a data pad. "The budget report for the new center on Kalos Prime. We are over budget on the tea supply again." "That is essential infrastructure," Adrian argued, taking the pad. "You cannot have a breakthrough without chamomile." Nira hummed a vibrating sound of contentment. She leaned back, looking up at the sky. The earth hung there, a blue marble, and next to it, the Nerian homeworld ships in orbit. "Do you remember the first day?" Nira asked. "When you insulted my ancestors and proposed marriage to me via a glitch?" "I recall it vividly," Adrian winced. "I believe I offered to soothe your warrior's burden with my soul rhythms." "It was a bold strategy," Nira said, her whiskers twitching. "Inefficient, but bold." She turned to look at him. Her eyes were warm. The bond between them had settled into something deep and quiet. It wasn't the fiery passion of a romance novel. It was the sturdy, weatherproof love of 2 people who had seen the worst of each other and decided to stay anyway. "The council sent a message," Adrian said, putting the pad down. "They want us to formalize the union, a diplomatic wedding, to cement the alliance." Nira snorted. "A wedding with speeches and politicians eating tiny cakes." "That is usually how it works," Adrian smiled. "I could wear a tuxedo. You could wear well shinier armor." Nira shook her head. She stood up and offered him a hand. "Come with me." She led him away from the war tent, out past the garden to the edge of the crater, where the view of the galaxy was unobstructed. The wind was gentle here, smelling of the new moss and the distant ozone. Nira stopped and turned to him. She took both his hands in hers. "I do not need a ceremony with politicians," Nira said. "And I do not need a translator to tell you what I am." She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "You are my strategist," she whispered. "You are the one who broke the lock. You are the one who stayed when the sirens screamed." She reached up and unclasped a small, silver locket from her armor. Inside was a piece of raw, unpolished amber, a fragment of her ancestral hearthstone. She pressed it into Adrian's hand. "This is the stone of the hearth," she said. "In my clan we do not exchange rings. We exchanged fire. Wherever you carry this, that is where my home is." Adrian looked at the stone. It was warm to the touch. He felt a lump in his throat. "I don't have a hearthstone," Adrian said. "No," Nira smiled. "But you have a playlist." Adrian laughed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own token, his old military dog tags. The ones that identified him as a senior analyst. He had kept them as a reminder of his sins. He placed them in Nira's hand. "These used to mean I was a ghost," Adrian said. "Now they just mean I am yours, if you'll have me." Nira closed her fingers over the metal tags. I will keep them, as a trophy of the only enemy I could not defeat. She leaned down and pressed her forehead against his, the Nerian gesture of absolute trust. Her fur tickled his skin. He could feel her breath, steady and warm. "No more microphones," Adrian whispered. "No," Nera agreed. "Just us." They stood there for a long time as the second moon rose, casting long shadows across the garden they had planted. Behind them, the war tent glowed like a beacon, a heart beating in the center of the scarred landscape. The war was a history book now. The craters were filled with roots. And Adrian Cole, the man who had once calculated death by the numbers, stood in the arms of the woman he loved, realizing that the only algorithm that truly mattered was the one that brought them back together. From high above, in the silent vacuum of space, the moon of Loomis no longer looked like a battlefield. It looked like a seed, green and growing, floating in the dark. Epilogue. 3 years later, a small transport ship landed at the Loomis spaceport. A group of tourists disembarked, looking around with wide eyes. They were led by a guide. "And this," the guide said, pointing to the massive forest of ironwood trees that now covered the Central Valley, "is the Peace Garden. It is the largest living memorial in the sector." "Is it true," a young human asked, "that the Cat General and the human strategist still live here?" "Oh yes," the guide smiled. "If you go to the central tent, the war tent of memory, you might see them. They teach the afternoon classes." "What do they teach?" someone asked. The guide looked toward the amber lights glowing through the trees. "They teach gardening," the guide said, "and how to make tea, and, occasionally, how to forgive the unforgivable." Inside the tent, Adrian Cole was trying to explain the concept of jazz to a confused Nerian cadet, while Naira Karras laughed softly in the background, pouring hot water into clay cups. The music played, the tea steamed, and the ghosts, finally at rest, slept soundly in the corners of the room.